This episode I'm joined by Stefan Ambrosie, who is an independent researcher and writer. We discuss the work and life of David Foster Wallace, alongside discussions on infinite jest, postmodernism, literature, posthumous fame, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers, making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Okay, so Stefan Ambrosie, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to be talking about the work of David Foster Wallace. So I imagine this episode will probably already be pretty divisive because he's kind of like Marmite for a lot of people, his work at least. People either love him or they hate him, or they just don't want anything to do with him. And you actually reached out to me, which is kind of lucky because I've been looking for someone to do an episode on David Foster Wallace's work for a while. And it's actually quite difficult to find people who are, writing secondary or using him in his work, using his work in their work. So yeah, it's a nice coincidence. But so before we sort of jump in, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do and how you came across Wallace.
Yeah, well, I'm a writer, independent researcher. I live in Barcelona, but I'm originally from Romania. So I usually write stuff about Eastern Europe, and I'm interested in a lot of weird aspects of Romanian culture. I write about that. And I think that also has something to do with why I was so drawn to Wallace in the first place. Because Romanian culture is like suffused with this fatalism or pessimism, whatever you want to call it. It's not just Turan. He's just the latest incarnation, so to speak. It's something deeply ingrained in the culture, almost at a mythopoetic level. Right? It's okay in small doses, but not all the time. It gets extremely toxic. Right? So growing up in that kind of environment, I was like, no, this is not for me. And I think like others, I was drawn to Wallace because he rejected any form of cynicism or apathy or, that's just how it goes, or the need to put everything in air quotes, topics like God or spirituality or self-help. But he doesn't do it in a naive way. That's what I like about him. It's like Kierkegaard's thing, right? You have to make the movement of infinite resignation before you even attempt the movement of faith, right? Before you get to embrace the finite, despite the horror, despite the absurd. And I think David Foster Wallace was not content with just being a knight of infinite resignation, and that's what I love about him.
Okay. And you wrote your master's thesis on Wallace's work, correct? Well, yeah. Not on his work, on his posthumous fame and the culture surrounding David Foster Wallace since his death.
Exactly, like how he's been appropriated, how the culture at large, right, uses him, maybe bands or shows or references in sitcoms, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, with the occasional times when used to watch TV, sort of. A few years ago, I'm trying to think how long ago it would have been, but there was an increase in Wallace references in heavily ironic ways in sort of very ironic and hip TV shows. And basically, it seemed to me that they were ignoring any substance for his work. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but it just seemed to be like a token gesture towards a certain kind of person.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's kind of a cool move that you want to make. You want to show people that you have read Infinite Jest. You know who Wallace is. Good for you. Of course, a lot of these writers, on these shows are fans. They want to show it, but yeah, they're kind of missing the point sometimes.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. It's one of I've had a few literary obsessions in my life, beginning with Albert Camus, going through to Christopher Hitchens for a while. Then Foster Wallace was the one after that. So he's one of the few authors whose literally his entire works inclusive of any sort of classroom materials I could get my hands on, I've read, and this was probably when I was about 18 through 19. I just had a year of, like, a year-long obsession. So, you know, I'm fairly familiar with his work, but it's been a while since I've sort of, you know, just talked about it or thought about it. So this could be interesting. But before we jump in, you know, the deep end with Wallace, I have to ask you the Hermitix question, which is you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? And as we're talking about a specific thinker, David Foster Wallace, we can already include him in the room and then add 3 more in.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think I know just the right people. I think I might want to prank Wallace with this one. So I'd bring in a few of the American postmodernists that I think he must have really enjoyed, to the point of feeling a very literal anxiety of influence, right? I already know what DeLillo thinks of Wallace. You know, they were friends. DeLillo liked Wallace, so I guess not DeLillo. It would have to be Pynchon, William Gaddis, and William Gass, and I have a good reason why for the last one. Here's what might happen. I want all of them to have read Infinite Jest and to comment on it, right? And Wallace would be behind this plexiglass window, in an interrogation room, and sweating profusely. I don't know if you've read William Gass's Omen Setter's Luck by any chance.
No, it's on the list.
Yeah, because I know for a fact Wallace was super obsessed with this book. You know, I found out about it because Wallace had reviewed it. You know, it's in both Flesh and Knot. And when I started reading it, it didn't take me long to come across this part in the book that seemed oddly familiar. Right, it's this conversation between an old man and a kid. You know, he's rambling, preaching to this kid, and the kid's only reaction in one paragraph is "golly." Now, I don't know if that sounds kind of familiar, but it's the conversation in Infinite Jest between the tennis coach, Stitt, and Mario Incandenza, right? He's rambling on about tennis and geometry, and old Mario could say, you know, he's politely listening. He goes like, gosh, you know, golly. This seems more than just a coincidence. My supervisor in the Netherlands, who helped me with my thesis, did not like Wallace at all. He kept reminding me that Wallace is just sort of like a literary chameleon, taking the best aspects of the American postmodernists like Barth, Pynchon, Barthelemy, just putting it into a blender and voila. So I think the conversation in that room might get a bit heated. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what your tutor would mean by that, but like one of the writers that Foster Wallace always gets compared to is Thomas Pynchon, and I understand why. He's in that same movement of the postmodern Americans, but in terms of style, I just really never saw it. I think people confuse just the fact that Infinite Jest is really long and sort of encyclopedic, and Gravity's Rainbow is also like that to a certain degree, but really they're completely different authors, and I think the similarities between DeLillo and Foster Wallace are really clear. But, you know, it seems that all those authors are very alike, but really when you come to read them all, much like most things in life, when you actually do your own investigations, they're really not. I mean, Donald Barthelme and Foster Wallace are miles apart. But I would like to say about your room that you realize how much Foster Wallace would absolutely hate that, right?
Yeah, I know. I'm being a bit cruel, but I am curious to know how he was influenced by these people, because people say he was influenced by, Pynchon, Barth, Barthelemy, whatever. He really liked them. He obviously had read these postmodernists, and sure, in certain respects, you read Gaddis and the conversations are very good, kind of like conversations in Infinite Jest. Certain tricks that Wallace pulls are a bit similar to some of the things that Gaddis does or Gass does. But I don't know. I'd be very curious to just have Wallace say, like, okay, well, this is what impressed me about these people, and I want them to sort of dissect that as well.
Okay. I mean, I suppose we should sort of begin with Infinite Jest. That's why everyone would, if you've heard of David Foster Wallace, it's probably because of Infinite Jest. Even though I think pretty much most of his works are worth the merit. There's a couple that I think are clearly weaker, but I do think actually his debut novel, The Brim of the System, is actually really, really good and nowhere near as bad as he made out. I think he was just personally ashamed of it, I think. Or not ashamed, but a bit more embarrassed by it. But, it's a super open question, but what are your thoughts on Infinite Jest?
Yeah, I think, well, this kind of gonna sound a bit strange, but I guess without Infinite Jest being there as this magnum opus, I don't know if I would have liked Wallace as much. That's weird to say, but what makes Wallace for me is Infinite Jest, right? If you look beyond the hype, it's an incredible book, incredibly intricate characters, the dysfunctional and Candenza family. It's something that is potentially life-saving, right? We're going to make this sound like therapy, Hermitix style, but I started reading Wallace after a major depression when I was in my early 20s, right? And I was struck by how Wallace knew exactly what depression felt like. Because when you're depressed, you don't have the energy to express these emotions in a work of fiction, right? Like, let alone something that good. And when I recovered, I forgot what it felt like, or couldn't really pin it down. So I think Wallace did the incredible here with Infinite Jest. He plumbed the depths of despair and came out with this uplifting and life-affirming style, right? Something that's the total opposite of someone like, I don't know, like Bret Easton Ellis. He's eternal rival, it has qualities that make it like a work that can heal you, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just showing you a dark world and that's it, right?
What do you think those healing qualities are?
I read somewhere that it is sort of a self-help book in the sense that it works as self-help when you read it, right? I was actually stunned to find out that you know the band the 1975. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was struck by the fact that Matt Healy, the lead singer, when he was in rehab, started reading Infinite Jest, of course, right? And apparently it influenced a lot of these lyrics. There's even a song called "Surrounded by Heads and Bodies," right? And of course, the 1975 can be kind of a cringy band, but cringe is a word we shouldn't use when we talk about Wallace and postmodernism. It's kind of it's kind of par for the course, right? I think Infinite Jest has this quality, like this sort of Russian novel type vibe, where it's not just this dark world. You get people who redeem themselves and redeem others. You got Mario and Candenza in Infinite Jest. More than any other character in Wallace's works is the epitome of this new sincerity movement, right? He's a holy fool, a saint-like young man who's horribly disfigured, but he's like an open book, an array of light, despite everything. I think in creating Mario or Don Gately, the reformed criminal, I think Wallace breached the dense cynicism that a work like Infinite Jest could have been about.
I think we should probably stop on the postmodernism comment because, there's the famous interview of Wallace where, I can't remember the name of the interviewer.
I think it's Charlie Rose, right?
Rose, that's the one, Charlie Rose, and he says, something about postmodernism, and Foster Wallace quickly stops him and says, aftermodernism. So I think already Wallace has a problem with the term postmodernism because there's a huge difference between postmodernism as we understand it in literary circles in terms of like that signifier for a movement and the actual etymological definition of that word, which literally, post as in meaning after. So Wallace, I think we should always be put in the category of aftermodernism because he's really struggling to do something which is actually more than modernism, yet at the same time remains sincere and doesn't just fall into the traps of the movement of postmodernism. So, it's really funny to me that he always gets pulled into, the hyper-ironic hip culture, because actually I think that was what his work was trying to sort of leap away from.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they say he's a Gen X writer, right? He's part of that generation, but it's just so much more, right? I don't think Wallace can be dated, if that makes any sense. Maybe in 50 years, sure, but I think he's even more relevant to the millennial cohort, right?
Yeah, I think he'll be relevant to the millennials, highly relevant, but I would actually disagree with you. I don't think he's going to go down in the canon, not for long. And that's not me saying that he's bad, but I think the culture that actually you're writing about in your thesis, which I read, this posthumous sort of almost saint-like culture which has been brought up around him, is going to be to his detriment in terms of being understood later on. You're going to have to wade through a lot of either like Bret Easton Ellis scorn or absolute fanboyism. There doesn't seem to be like this middle sensible ground for Wallace.
Yeah. I agree that it's unfortunate that Wallace isn't great, period, right? I don't know, in some ways he kind of reminds me of Salinger, right? Like reading Wallace feels like discovering Salinger all over again, but Salinger is, I don't know, like he's someone that people read and who have this, you have this connection with Salinger's characters, with his voice, right? But I don't know, he's not Melville, right? I don't think Infinite Jest will be a sort of Moby Dick in 100 years. Definitely not. I'm just very curious where he's just going to land, right? Is he just going to be this cliche where, these white male, middle class men read him and annoy their girlfriends, and sort of try to get them to read Infinite Jest? It's just such a painful legacy, I think. Someone like him.
Yeah. I mean, that's the classic joke that Infinite Jest is the book that's on every sort of douchebag's bookshelf. There you go.
Yeah.
So moving into sort of the content of his writing, just with something to begin with, why do you think addiction was such a big theme for him?
Well, it's addiction in the sense of substance abuse. That was something he definitely went through, but also more benign addictions, right? Stuff that we don't really think about. This compulsion to scroll, this thing that if you just push a button, you might make everything right in the world. Just one more click. That's what Wallace writing was worried about. He was worried about the future of human connection and empathy, right? Compared to all the American postmodernists I just mentioned, who are kind of cold, not exactly feel good. I think Wallace embraced this, sickly sweet middlebrow culture with the self-help literature that can get you past these toxic habits, right? Our addictions, and among which you find postmodern irony, rolling your eyes, all of that. That also plays a role in how he envisaged our present difficulties. And honestly, it's just getting worse, especially nowadays with me being subscribed to a ton of platforms and streaming services and using none of them because I feel totally paralyzed. I think these are part of the predictions that I wrote about in my thesis, but we'll get to that later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's the culture he's tackling is relatively, I don't know, it seems perhaps for the younger generation a bit easier to define, the sort of constant malaise and melancholy and boredom. What Why do you think he saw that as so important? As something so important that it needed to be written about and articulated?
Well, this malaise, this boredom is, especially in very well developed countries, right? This can lead to a lot of problems, a lot of mental health problems, right? I think just like Mark Fisher, who kind of reminds me of Wallace in certain respects, he knew how to pin down this connection between the world where we're living in and how it makes us horribly depressed, where we're pulled in a lot of different directions. We don't know where to go, like what to invest in, invest our time, our energy, right? And it just puts so much stress on the nervous system, right?
Yeah, could you expand on that a little bit?
It's just I don't know. I mean, it's probably a very personal question, but have you ever had depression? Have you ever had like any?
Yeah, but now I don't. Nowadays I don't really consider it that. Like my subjective understanding of depression has changed over time. But at one point, yeah.
Yeah,
and I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who's not working in not to sound too arrogant, but like the intellectual sphere, who hasn't gone through some sort of, what you'd consider a depression. I can't remember who the writer was who said that I can't take anyone seriously unless they've been through a good season of depression. Yeah,
unfortunately. I think a lot of writers, make this connection with mental illness and let's say intellectual interests, right? But the thing about Wallace is he was really smart, like super duper smart, and there's this thing that kind of annoys me, the fact that he has to dumb himself down in a way to find self-help meaningful. You get that sense, like, I'm just so smart. Oh, but I'm looking at this stuff that people read and buy in airports. This stuff has some truth in it. It's got these simple truths, like one day at a time, whatever. Like I don't know. There's something a bit arrogant about that in Wallace.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's the story. You have to forgive me if my memory's sort of given up on me here. I think it's in Good Old Neon, where it's the discussion between the therapist and the let's say the patient, and the patient's just over-intellectualizing everything and not actually allowing the work to help them, because they're constantly deconstructing it and trying to sort of one-up the therapist, which is sort of like, which is sort of probably why I moved away from Wallace fairly swiftly after I was sort of 19, is because I personally think that attitude of deconstruction is extremely unhealthy, which is probably, something to be said about what happened to Wallace. Is if you continue down that path of just constantly picking things apart in that manner, obviously nothing's ever going to be constructive. But yeah, there is always that bind of him having the struggle of, the bind between, as you say, is kind of arrogant, but between being extremely intelligent and at the same time actually needing these very simplistic mechanisms to help himself.
Yeah, I mean, these simplistic mechanisms, these techniques, whether it's mindfulness or whatever, Tai Chi, yoga, gratefulness, meditation. Of course, I resorted to that to recover. Right? It was weird because I felt the need to roll my eyes. Right? You go to therapy and you're told, right? You need to breathe in. You need to forgive everyone. You need to, but I think for Wallace it must have been doubly hard because he just would not let that big brain of his cool down.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we could ever separate his biography from his work?
And that's a tricky question. I mean, what attracted me to Wallace in the first place was his persona, right? The fact that he had written this kooky 1,000-page book that not a lot of people read. I remember seeing a picture of him after the suicide. He's got his bandana on and that wistful look about him, looking in the distance. I thought he kind of looked like Axl Rose. This is an important American author. I had to find out what it was all about. And his depression does play a huge role in his fiction. You can't really separate it. The tragic aspect of his suicide cements that ultimate suffering artist vibe. And it's not very easy to read Wallace without thinking about the context, about his life and his death, especially when reading The Pale King. But the biography, but I don't know if you've read the biography, D.T. Max's.
Every love story is a ghost story.
Yeah. That one, like right at the end, it just gets so heavy and depressing, right? Like Wallace in his last days, it's something that you can't really separate, right? And here I think you get the difference between Salinger and Wallace. You don't know a lot of stuff about Salinger because he was so secretive, but Wallace was this pop star, basically, always in the spotlight.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is why, one of the questions is, why do you think, why is Foster Wallace this love him or hate him type figure? And I think, as I said earlier, I think this culture which has been brought up around him really doesn't help to that, because he's sort of become like a Warhol type figure in that he is seen for him as opposed to the war. He's only really known for his work, and yet now he's known because he's known, right?
Yeah.
And I realized this sort of hit me full force when, would have been a couple of years after my Wallace obsession, that I watched The End of the Tour, which is like the biopic about him with Jason Segel playing Foster Wallace. And you realize that they've somehow just changed this writer into like an almost wise old seer, and they really managed to dramatize a book launch and the idea of Infinite Jest, and they managed to sort of really, I don't know, build up this strange culture around him. I don't know what how you felt about that film.
Yeah, it was an okay movie,
it could have been far worse. It could have been far worse.
It could have been worse. I mean, I think Jason got Wallace right, I guess. Kind of. I was more annoyed between him and the chemistry between him and what's his name, the guy from the Social Network, Eisenberg. Jesse Eisenberg. I mean, I don't know. It felt very forced, right? But while watching the movie, I was like, okay, you can't roll your eyes, you can't cringe. It's kind of like the part of Wallace, right? He's the whole thing is that I'm this shucks kind of guy from the Midwest, and I'm this sage. You come to me for advice in this house in the middle of nowhere. But there was a really sneaky promo campaign that I think Lil Brown did when they were trying to hype up Infinite Jest. I don't know if you know about this.
Yeah, there was sending out postcards, right?
Yeah, sending them out to like publishers and critics. It's like, I expect something big, something infinite, something. Right? It was weird because I think Wallace mentioned it in the Charlie Rose interview. He did the math, and of course it's impossible to read that book, right, and to also turn out these reviews. I mean, there wasn't enough time for these people to read the book, so it felt like a sort of like people wanting to like Wallace simply because of the hype. He's got his persona all down, his bandana, right? And of course, the cliche that people buy Infinite Jest and never read it, they have it on their shelves like a trophy or a status symbol. But I don't know. I think people who are genuinely obsessed about Wallace actually read Wallace. Right? I've met a lot of people who are I don't know, like Marx fanboys who have only read the Communist Manifesto, or you get that with Nietzsche too. You don't really have to read that much to get obsessed with it. But with Wallace, you really have to put in the effort to finish Infinite Jest, and then then you definitely have an obsession, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, seems to be a fairly tight-knit group, and also those who are sort of don't like his work are, just as against him. But I think there's reasons for this, because, and even Wallace admits to this himself, is that, and I find nothing wrong with this. I know these days people would say there is, but Wallace makes it clear that his audience is white, middle class, smart, educated men, right? It doesn't really sway from that too much. And that's largely what he's writing about as well, because it's what he knows. So I think the criticisms that it's not, how Wallace writes women, we can get to that biography bit, or how he writes other things, I think, well, isn't that always going to be a bit contextual into, whatever it is you're born as? So there, I think, is a reason why a lot of people will find him, just don't get into him. It's because I think it speaks to a certain kind of person, and if you're not that person, I don't think you're fully going to get what he's trying to explain.
Yeah, this stereotype about the Wallace fanboy being white, middle class, or maybe upper middle class. Yeah, I get that a lot. I mean, as I said before we started the episode, you're actually the first and only person I've met who's actually read Wallace. And this is weird. I mean, I met people from the English department in Romania and in the Netherlands. They just don't want to touch him. Right? He's I think people who hate Wallace don't really read him. I feel, right. I mean, if you don't want to read a 1,000-page book because you're already biased against the author, right, for whatever, being white and privileged, then you're not going to do it, right? I wouldn't do it, right, if I didn't want to read Pynchon. Of course, I'm not going to start reading Gravity's Rainbow. But I resent that a lot, right? I'm just going to say it. I want it to be on record. I find it very awful to say that, oh, Wallace is just this privileged white man, and what he has to say about suffering and mental illness and pain is rendered null by that somehow, right?
That always frustrated me. I mean, privileged white male would frustrate me. It just annoys me generally. I think it's a cop-out for probably a larger social context, or perhaps the fact that, it's an easy out, is what I'd say. But no, I was just trying to focus on the fact that I think Wallace makes it clear that his audience is a specific audience, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Exactly. He owns up to it, right? That's what he knows. That's his background, right? Mm-hmm. And he's just spelling it out for an audience that he knows he can talk to, right? Uh-huh. Yeah. It's telling them, oh, you're not too smart for genuine kindness or corny, feel good tips, right? It's kind of tailored to that kind of person,
Yeah, people who at that time are completely so steeped in irony that they forget sincerity even exists.
Yeah, exactly. Or they're afraid that they won't seem cool, if they just let go with their preconceptions and just.
Do you think that project for him, that sort of post-ironic project, was a success?
Yes and no. I mean, I believe it was a success. I mean, small step, because his writing seemed to have shifted. Right, you sense this change of tone if you compare Infinite Jest to Pale King. Right, in Infinite Jest, it's all very zany. It's like these old Nickelodeon cartoons, and you're almost encouraged to read those dense paragraphs at breakneck speed. But with Pale Jest, I felt like it was a more sober book. It felt slower, but not in a bad way, right? Like, I think that's when Wallace was really starting to break away from what do you call it, postmodern irony and cynicism, right? There are parts of Pale King that, I don't know, get me all weepy, but they're very good. too bad it's not finished, right? But still, there's a sense in which it's hard to let go of irony, right? It's such an effective defense mechanism. You can laugh at anything, can be a weapon, right? And as Wallace wrote in that essay, Unitas Plurum, he wanted there to be a different generation that can then let go of this safety blanket and do things in a way where, you know, there's no fear of being maudlin or cringe, right? A cringe culture and just straight up single entendre principles. I love that expression, right? I think it's hard. I think for him it was hard because he was coming from, you know, that tradition. He really liked those postmodernists, and I guess he was afraid to write in a way that felt like really honest. Like he was afraid that if he didn't have, I don't know, a reference or a pomo technique in there, people might find it cringe, right?
Yeah. Do you think that was one of his frustrations, that because he was sort of banded in with that group of writers who did utilize irony a lot, that he thought he, you know, might not ever be able to escape it, and a lot of what is taken from his work is often taken ironically. You know, even the whole atmosphere is understood ironically at times.
Yeah. He tried to break away from that. He definitely felt some sort of imposter syndrome. That's why I wanted a little therapy session with Wallace and some of his purported influences, just to sort of get it out. You know, he felt like a fraud. You know, that's what I'm getting from all of these interviews and from, you know, researching Wallace and reading the biography. He felt like not just a fraud, but that he would not touch people in a way that, I don't know, he wanted to be like Dostoevsky or something like that. He wanted to not just have these intellectual mind games and these self-reflexive techniques. He also wanted you to turn your life around, I think.
So why then do you think Infinite Justice is... Do you think that's one of the reasons that it's held in such high esteem by those who have read it, and it's rated by many, especially online polls when people do these sort of best books of, the last 50 years or whatever polls, it often comes up near the top. Do you think that that's one of the reasons that it had this sort of cathartic release where we finally could get away from the almost like the post-structural mind games we were playing with ourselves, trying to prove that we're clever, and then finally this book comes out that says, you know what? It's fine to, I can't remember to paraphrase one of my favourite Wallace quotes, is like, the next generation's rebel will be those who treat old heartfelt convictions with an earnestness and sincerity, right? So the new rebellion is to say, like, no, I mean what I say, I feel what I feel. Do you think that's why it's so popular?
Yeah. And not just that, like, the context is everything, right? Because the world of Infinite Jest is a very dark world, and you have people in it, like the characters in it, that make this effort to be, you know, I'm just going to be honest, I'm going to be sincere, I'm going to try to turn my life around. And it is the kind of book that when you start reading it, it is very addictive, right? It feels like an addiction itself. You know, the experience of reading Infinite Jest. I used to wake up at 6 a.m. just to read a bit before going on about my day, right? Mm-hmm. And it has this amazing sense of humor, like amid all the chaos and the grimy, horrible aspects, especially the part about the halfway house. But there's this sense of humor where, you know, there are a few books that actually get me to laugh or even smile, right? Well, not to mention I do a spit take or whatever. The only other book that actually got chuckles out of me was The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien. That one's just as weird as Infinite Jest, but it is laugh out loud funny. You know, the humor is definitely Gen X, but there's something about it that kind of reminds me of, you know, scrolling down YouTube comments and seeing people who joke about being depressed and wanting to take their own lives, but you're not really sure because it's also funny. It's kind of a bit of both, right? But it's refreshing in a way. It's not just ironic, or it's not just sarcasm. It's something else. There's a bit of truth in those comments. You know that this person's going through a lot. You know.
Do you think do you think Infinite Jest did a good job at predicting the future, we basically now live in, and the one we're heading into? I can't remember what the dates of Infinite Jest would be. There is a way to work it out.
I think it was, I might remember this incorrectly, but kind of 2019. I think someone worked it out, and it's, 2020 would definitely be the world of Infinite Jest. People have made a big deal about these predictions, right? Oh, Wallace predicted Netflix, binge watching, he predicted Trump, but I kind of disagree. I think it's merely an extension of the present that he knew, that he actually experienced. He just took those things to their logical conclusion. So I remember, for example, Wallace talking about virtual reality and porn, and well, lo and behold, that's actually a thing now. Or with Trump, he was definitely spoofing Reagan with that character in Infinite Jest. President Johnny Gentle of Oman, the germophobic pop star president. That's basically Trump, but it's actually just a bit of Reagan and a bit of Howard Hughes. So it might just be the fact that Wallace sensed that things would only just get weirder from now on, like especially our addictions to screen time, that might actually get worse. I kind of give my right arm to Noe's opinion about the culture wars nowadays, about Tumblr and the alt-right and SJWs and stuff like that. But he didn't seem to be like a very online person. Apparently he was not very good at being online, like using the internet, which is very strange. People talk about Infinite Jest being a very internet book, with quote unquote hyperlinks and all of that, but he was pretty old fashioned.
Yeah, I mean, there's that one rare thing online where he was part of an online chat room, but I don't think he was in it very long. If you've seen that, well, from his biography, I understand that anything which would cause. I mean, he didn't have a TV in his house because he just would just watch it all the time, right? So I don't think he would have had the internet in his house. I think that would have been the absolute end. I would personally make the prediction that I think that our attention to smartphones, social media, and the internet in general has gone above and beyond what he ever predicted it would. I mean, obviously the plot of Infinite Jest is about basically, very roughly, is about a video cassette. There's another name for it, but I can't remember what it is right now. A video cassette, which is
I remember.
That's the one. That's so entertaining that once you turn it on and watch it, that's all you ever want to do for the rest of your life. You just want to keep watching it. And we're I think way closer than that in Infinite Jest is probably one of the few bits where it's so ridiculous it's like absurd. But now I think it would be worrying that actually that isn't that absurd. I don't want to sound like too much of a boomer, but the when you look at the average time people spend on their phones every day, when you think that if you're asleep for 8 hours, a lot of people somehow spend 8 to 10 hours on their phone every day. So we're not far off, right?
I think if Wallace were alive, he would be totally okay with digital Sabbaths and all of that. But this world is too much even for him. Right? It's the MacGuffin of Infinite Jest. The cartridge. I love that word because it's so obviously dated. It reminds me of those video games, with the duck hunting.
I mean, I wonder if he did that on purpose, because Infinite Jest is coming out when? 1993?
I think it was 96.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But, my sort of knowledge of technological history is pretty bad, I've just realised. But I think DVDs would have been just about around.
Yeah, I don't know.
CDs definitely would, right?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting to think about what type of words he wanted to use, to make sure that Infinite Jest is relevant, or maybe not, right? If there's this creative writing class that he was teaching, where, or maybe no, he was a student or whatever in a creative writing class, and someone said, okay, don't mention present technology in your story, that's gonna date it or whatever. But Wallace was like, but we mentioned cars, right? We mentioned telephones. Like, some things are not that contemporaneous. Like, they're not going to vanish in 50 years. It's safe to use certain things. But luckily for him, and unfortunately for us, being glued to our screens is a reality. And having this very weird online world, with shit posting and post irony, and it's all very weird. He would not be okay with shit posting, maybe.
Mm-hmm. So let's just touch on the posthumous fame since his death, because that's that was the focus of your thesis. I mean, what do you make of it?
Well, in terms of posthumous books, it's nothing career defining. I think this is no Confederacy of Dunces. Pale King is a really good book. It's unfinished, but still sort of works. But Wallace disliked closure anyway, right? Infinite just didn't have that either. So it's fitting in a way that his career is still being assessed. I feel people are still trying to figure out if he's here to stay, if he's a big name in American letters or not. But it's undeniable that he's had a massive influence on younger writers and even his peers. I haven't read much of all the other people he was friends with. I know, like Franz, and I've read Eugenides, but I know, like, the younger ones, Jonathan Safran Foer. I've read Everything is Illuminated, and that is a very Wallace book. Right? It has that same buoyancy and energy that Wallace brought to the table. And apparently Junot Díaz writes like Wallace, according to Michiko Kakutani. But I don't know. Díaz is just awful. I'm sorry for any fans out there. He's a hack. I'm sorry. But like Díaz, Wallace got dragged through the mud with the whole Me Too scandals, right? Which is understandable, because Wallace was known for being this very creepy stalker and sleeping with these students, not to mention the crazy shit he pulled on poet Mary Carr, plotting to murder her husband, throwing a coffee table at her, pushing her out of a moving car. He had these major issues with women that plague this humble pie eating self-help guru image that it was obviously very carefully cultivated, right? The movie The End of a Tour makes it out to be something benign. Wallace is a bit jealous. Don't talk to his ex. But it was definitely a bit darker than that, a lot darker than that, right? And I think someone else has definitely stepped in and taken Wallace's place, in terms of being a self-help guru and disliking postmodernism. I mean, of course, Jordan Peterson, who was also considered the lobster from a different angle. And I don't know. I haven't read much Peterson. I've watched a lot of the videos, but it struck me like he's kind of like Wallace with an agenda. But compared to Wallace, I suspect he hasn't really read any of these French theorists that he's ranting on about.
He hasn't.
Yeah, he hasn't, right?
I mean, I can't back that up. But he uses postmodernism in the extremely lazy way too. And I don't mind Peterson, right? I don't mind Peterson at all. But I would say one thing, which is stay in your lane, right? Which is like 12 Rules for Life is a great practical self-help book, and he's probably a really great psychologist. But as soon as he begins going a bit too hard down, especially the Nietzsche route and Jung, I'm no specialist in them, but it's like this sort of token gesture for using them, as opposed to just saying like, you don't need to back up those ideas with anything super intellectual. And as far as the postmodernists go, he uses that word a lot, but then if you sort of search in his work, which there isn't that much of really, I mean, you got 12 Rules for Life and you got Maps of Meaning, there isn't any overt sort of interaction with, say, Baudrillard, Derrida, or, Foucault or Deleuze. So I think it's a lazy get out card for him there, really.
Yeah. I was actually, when I first found out about Peterson and he was, criticizing postmodernism, I was like, oh, this kind of reminds me of Wallace. Let's see what he has to say. But I mean, it's not a bad thing, to criticize anything, especially postmodernism. But I would really like it if he'd actually read and engaged with these thinkers, because it's just a shame, right? It's just like this catch-all term, right? But I do think he has helped a lot of young people, get their shit together, which is okay. He is pretty good as a self-help guru, but it just makes me think that Wallace is not among us anymore. When with all this interest in biopolitics and mental illness and capitalism, like Mark Fisher, I think these topics are as relevant as ever. I think he would have been a great presence, especially nowadays.
Where do you think listeners should begin with Wallace if they haven't read any before?
Well, I first started out with, people say go read his essays, which are very well written. I think he's a good essay writer and got this journalistic eye, but I think they should just dive right into Infinite Jest. That is kind of risky, but you'll know. Right, around the, let's say, 100-page mark, you'll know if he's your kind of guy or not. Right, it's the sort of book that defines Wallace so much. Like it's everything I love about him. Right, because in other works, like that Posthumous one, Above Flesh and Not. Have you read that one? That's that's the one which is merely okay. It's got this very creepy essay about AIDS that kind of makes you a bit sick. But I don't recommend anything like that. Like I want them to start strong. Like go and seek the best Wallace there is. Which is Infinite Jest.
Okay. Is there anything you would like to add that you think we've missed that you think is key?
Well, we could talk about him being a Gen Xer, because I don't think either of us is a Gen Xer, right?
Well, I don't really know the years of generations too well.
Yeah, I guess you would have to be in your 20s or 30s in the 90s to qualify as a Gen Xer, I guess. We might be millennials, I'm assuming.
Oh, God. That's awful. That's the worst news I've had all year.
Yeah, that's, if you're in your 20s or 30s, I think the latest is like 39, you're still a millennial, I guess.
I'd rather be a boomer.
Yeah, or a doomer, right? But yeah, it's about this thing. Like we don't really understand this generation. I don't, right? These Gen Xers, grunge era, right? Because I also do a lot of research and writing about comics, right? Especially those that are like the voice of a generation. There's this very famous comic book from the 90s that kind of encapsulates the era called Buddy Does Seattle by Peter Bagg. It's kind of like the 90s in a nutshell, very grunge, but it's chock full of horrible characters, and it's hard to connect with any of them. I don't know. Looking at it, like reading it, this doesn't seem like the kind of environment that someone like Wallace would come out of. Maybe as a reaction against it, right? Because if you compare something that's very Gen Y or Gen Z, which would be Simon Hanselman's Meg and Mog series, that one is a stoner comedy superficially, but then the characters get really like fleshed out in ways that are positively heartbreaking, right? That's a very it's something straight out of Wallace, right? Where the irony and the sincerity are both center stage, but you don't know where one begins and the other ends. But I think his voice is definitely more that of a millennial in Gen Xer clothing. But of course, there's a lot of generalizing about generations, which is always very fun. But it's kind of like these neat categories.
Yeah, I'm not sure how constructive it is.
Yeah, well, probably not at all. But
no, I mean in terms of Wallace's work and what Wallace would actually think about, sort of categorizing generations. I think it would probably go along the lines of his ideas, of failure as a dangerous idea. As soon as you're categorized in a certain generation, you might feel some sort of guilt or something along these lines, or you might feel that your generation is doomed or something along these lines, as opposed to taking on some personal responsibility. So I think there's something a bit dangerous in that. Yeah.
Definitely with Wallace, because people try to pigeonhole him, right? I mean, I've read so many reviews and obituaries where he's the voice of Generation X, he's the voice of whatever. It must have been a lot of pressure to a lot of expectations to sort of conform to that, I guess, or just being bombarded with these buzzwords. Like, grunge, grunge Salinger, right? That's what Elizabeth Wurzel said about him, which is, I know, my head kind of hurts thinking about that term, a grunge Salinger. It's just so ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a strange one. I hadn't heard that one before. Huh.
Yeah, I mean, sure, he does remind me of Salinger, but it's, yeah, no.
I think that just cheapens both of them.
Yeah, it does. And Wallace using, I don't know, like references to Pearl Jam or REM, like whatever, that doesn't make it, that doesn't make him a Gen X, Gen Xer. It's just probably not very productive to think about in those terms.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not really. Maybe I just ask you about whether you consider Wallace to be worthy of this critical acclaim. I mean, you read him when you were 18, 19. People are supposed to read Wallace in their 20s. I've been told, like 25. Douchebags in their 20s are supposed to read Wallace, right? So I was actually in my 20s, so I was the perfect douchebag for that. But what about you? What do you think? What do you think about Wallace and his legacy? Like, what do you think he will?
I think the reason I moved away from him is because it's the same reason I move away from a lot of continental philosophers, even though I sort of adore them, is that they get stuck in their own loops and are too afraid to exit them for sake of some cost. So Wallace gets stuck in over intellectualizing and doesn't want to admit to simple truths and doesn't really want to admit to potential truth generally. So I think almost to a certain extent, it is something to get out of the way when you're young, and it's certainly helpful if you're in a certain sort of mindset, which I've sort of since moved well beyond. So it's helpful at the time. It's helpful in a certain context, but there's a big question there of whether or not Wallace is still Wallace without his context, and I would just say I don't think he is at all. Obviously, that literature was born of that context, and I think it will last another. I think it will become actually more relevant in, say, within 10 years, but I think after that, it will become very quickly not relevant because I just think everything will have moved on just enough that it seems very dated. I don't think there's a problem with that. I think it has its time and its place, but I don't think he's going to be seriously canonized. So, yeah, and I mean, reading it at 18, can't really see too much. I mean, I guess read it if you want to read it. It's hard to think back now. I mean, that's like 8 years ago for me, which I've sort of had so many intellectual and almost ontological alterations of myself in that time from reading various authors and various texts that it's almost impossible for me to recollect how I thought about Wallace at the time. I know I was completely obsessed to the point of annoying a lot of friends.
Oh yeah, been there.
But yeah, it's hard to sort of recollect what I got from it then.
Yeah, Wallace fatigue really sets in right after you've read a ton. You're like, whoa, he's the most amazing writer alive, and then you're like, okay, enough, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like me nowadays. I'm on a Bataille binge, and I'm like, sticking a gibbon in the dirt and having it shit out like a sunflower. Oh, not this again,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, every time you read.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, but okay.
Yeah.
But that seems like a good place to finish up. So, Stefan Ambrosie, thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, thanks.